Thank you ever so much for the wonderful introduction. Thank you so much for having me. It's a fantastic honor and pleasure to be here. I hope you had a wonderful week. I hope I won't spoil it in the end with my lecture. I guess I don't have that power, so I don't have that responsibility. But seriously, I will start in a place of somewhat darkness, and then it'll get better. So don't run out after 10 minutes, or don't throw me into the river after just 10 minutes. Wait until a bit later. What we have done, we who do arbitration and investment arbitration in particular, has gotten us into a pretty kettle of fish. It's quite the predicament, really. People take to the streets against what we do. They protest and block international treaties because with investment arbitration, I quote, corporations are grabbing power. The UN lambasts us. One of its special rapporteurs reviewing the evidence finds that investment arbitration, I quote again, has become a major obstacle to the urgent actions needed to address the planetary, environmental, and human rights crises. We, the people who belong to the world of arbitration and share in the collective responsibility simply by belonging to it, we stand in the way of fixing the world. It makes us, in the eyes of that special rapporteur and all that he represents, it makes us, I quote, unjust, undemocratic, and dysfunctional. NGOs have long decried us, calling us modern pirates, because we, arbitration lawyers, help corporations seize national assets and limit state autonomy. Nobel Prize economists say we make no economic sense at all and call investment arbitration a kangaroo court because it enforces a legal regime that badly attributes responsibility and thus creates the wrong kind of economic incentives. Journalists paint a picture of us as a scourge of society because we increase socioeconomic inequalities and reduce the possibilities that societies have to decide for themselves how they want to live, what value judgments they want to make for themselves. Politicians on the left and on the right delicately take their distances from us or brutally throw us under the bus. People hate us, despise us, mock us who do arbitration. It's like private bankers at the height of the financial crisis. Only it doesn't stop. I don't like it. Obviously, I'm not the only one who doesn't like it. 15 years ago, when all that started and the phrase backlash against investment arbitration burst into the discussion, the reaction of those who didn't like the criticism was mostly to change it, the criticism, to try to silence it. Those who criticized investment arbitration, the refrain went, are people who are not in the practice of it, and therefore they don't understand it. They don't know what they are talking about. Leave us to our own devices, we said. Let the experts do their job and stay where you belong, we told the critics. There were then, 15 years ago, two categories of people, two competing epistemic communities vying for knowledge production. The first was made up of those who had or were building a career in investment arbitration, depending on it for their professional and social place in the world. They needed investment arbitration to thrive so that they could thrive. Many of the top people in it needed it in order to be top people, to stand out, to be someone, to have the success they thought would get them over the threshold and be happy. The new entrants were following the same routes. They were discovering a new market, in which a field in which it was back then comparatively easy to get a job. Major law firms were conducting recruitment interviews on the occasion of a bout of teaching and arbitration programs, hiring people on the spot, careers instantly made. The days were good, and the spirits were high in that community. Success, stardom, relatively easy money, hopes of bright individual futures. It shines so bright, it dimmed their vision, blunted their critical thinking, distorted their judgments. Criticism, discontent with investment arbitration, were affronts to their personal dreams and couldn't be heard. These people did what they had to do in order that they would not be denied. They used the arsenal of their legal skills, including the entire array of Schopenhauer's 38 ways to win an argument, this wonderful satirical compendium of unscrupulous ways to defeat one's opponents in a debate. It was not a quest for understanding. It was a quest for prevailing, come hell or high water, a quest for individual socio-professional survival. They had conflicts of interests in their speech, but the IBA guidelines, which I'm sure you have studied this or seen this week, the IBA guidelines on conflicts of interest didn't apply to them in that role. Their epistemology, their version of the truth, came from a deep need for individual material security and social belonging and position. The second category of people were outsiders, those who looked on and asked questions about potentially inconvenient truths, questions about the effects of this system, questions about the system's adequacy with its raison d'etre, questions about what the parties really got out of it, questions about how it all fits into society, how it fits into our collective, or with our collective values, how it disproportionately favors certain values over others. As Susan Strange famously said, communities need 4 core values to be realized in order to be content: prosperity, peace, justice, and freedom. The investment arbitration system was heavy on prosperity and peace, but justice in it was only really felt by lawyers with paychecks in hand. And the freedom of people to self-determine was being reduced to formal pacta sunt servanda. If you consented to something, you consented to something, it's your problem. If your government or a previous government signed a treaty with vague terms, which now prevent you from collectively doing in your society what you think is ethically right, it's your problem. These questions and the people who asked them were largely brushed aside 15 years ago. There was so much money to be made. Those who asked the questions were, as I already said, outsiders, and authority was withheld from them on that ground, on the grounds of what they wanted to speak about. Many of them were also mocked for their apparent or real class anger, this feeling that some people have everything, don't want to share, and they know better than you, so let's take these people down. The critics were portrayed as people who criticize because what they really want is their share of the spoils. What they really want to change is who gets to milk the cow, not whether milking the cow is a good idea in the first place. There is something to it. How many of my own friends criticized it all along when they were outsiders and found it all rosy when they got their share. These two groups of people, these two epistemic communities, they were separate. They were barely learning from one another. They were barely talking. And one of the communities seems poised to take over the other as the silencing blankets of money extended further and further. And then several things happened in succession. First, there was an accumulation of evidence. Empirical studies pointed to problems. Political scientists and a few economists moved into the fields and brought their methodological expertise, allowing us to spot the remains of Schopenhauer's 38 argumentative fallacies in some of the early empirical studies. And with this, progressively, expertise in the field shifted. Those who didn't bathe in the practice of arbitration had some understanding of it after all. Everyone was forced to recognize. Just like art critics have something to say about arts, even if they're not artists themselves. Within the fields, the balance of epistemic authority, who gets to say what really is, the balance of epistemic authority between the two groups shifted in favor of the observers, the outsiders, the critics. Better instincts of true understanding, they prevailed over logophobia, the fear of open discussion without argumentative fallacies. The discourse shifted shape. It became clear within the fields that there were things that needed fixing. The second thing that happened was that information about what we do, about investment arbitration, got to wider audiences. Journalists, then technocrats in governments and in international organizations, then the general public and politicians learns about investment arbitration, how it works and how it feels to work. It became clear beyond the field that changes were required. And so the age of reforms began. Reform projects took place under the aegis of international organizations like ICSID or the OECD, UN agencies like UNCITRAL and UNCTAD, and many national governments. BITs, bilateral investment treaties, were renegotiated to lower foreign investor protection. A wind of change had started to blow. The agenda in the field was no longer to change the discourse, to bring the critics under control, but to change investment arbitration to bring the system under control. It was acknowledged ever more that we need to alter reality, not what is said about reality. Just as climate change deniers were decreasing in numbers and were given less platform, so were investment arbitration problem deniers. And just as with climate change, interventions in the system, attempts to fix it, abounded. And yet, Federico Ortino published a paper last year on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Journal of International Economic Law, in which he argued, I quote, that while a lot has changed in 2.5 decades, in particular the amount and breadth of criticism against investor-state arbitration, ISDS, investor-state arbitration, ISDS remains fundamentally the same, at least if one focuses on the practice of ISDS. Investment arbitration remains fundamentally the same, at least if one focuses on its practice. The paper is convincing. The author, an authority in the field, and an exemplar of probity and balanced views. There are reforms then, but the reforms don't really reform anything. Thomas Dietz, a German political scientist, came to the same conclusion when looking at the political effects of investment arbitration. They remain fundamentally the same. Wolfgang Altschner made a similar empirical observation in his recent book with respect to BITs, bilateral investment treaties. Change the treaties, he found the decisions come out the same. The, I quote, newly designed investment treaties are interpreted like old ones in investment arbitration, he shows. Again, brilliant study, and again, authoritative author. Change the texts, it doesn't change what the regime actually does. Reform the law on the books, the law in action remains the same. Nothing really changes. And so the discontent with investment arbitration doesn't change either. We remain like private bankers at the height of the financial crisis, only it doesn't stop. Some of us want change. Some of us care about the discontent, care about doing what's right in the eyes of the majority out there, care about the fact that governments, IOs, NGOs, civil society say we and what we do is not good for this world, not in the way we do it, but how to get through reforms. The current attempts to intervene in the system, they don't seem really to have much effect. So what is one to do? I believe there are 4 misunderstandings in how we approach investment arbitration, and to some extent arbitration in general. I will review them in turn. The first misunderstanding is simple. We have tended to treat investment arbitration as a singular, one-size-fits-all category. Studies on the effects of investment arbitration have put them all together. All the investment arbitrations have not discriminated between different types. Problems with investment arbitration are typically treated as if they concern all types of claims equally. And thus, the discontent with investment arbitration is directed at it as a singular, uniform category. And so defenses of investment arbitration defending it all en bloc. If you look closely at the behavior of states, not their declarations, but what they actually do, things become clear. It becomes clearer what exactly the problem is. And it might bring the supporters and the opponents together if they're not too far on the extremes on either side. Empirical studies on the behavior of states in the context of investment arbitration have shown a few years ago, in particular in great papers by Alexander Thompson, Thomas Bruder, and Joram Haftel, these studies have shown that states don't like to be sued in investment arbitration. And in reaction, they change the treaties, they change the BITs. Once countries are sued, they will statistically lower foreign investor protection and increase their own regulatory space. You sue me, I don't like it, I reduce your rights and I increase mine. The apparent purpose of that is to decrease the risk of being successfully sued again in later investment arbitrations. I repeat, you sue me, I don't like it, I reduce your rights. Once a law in force becomes a law with force, once its effects are felt and you lose a buck, you react and you try to do something about it. States don't like investment arbitration when it is used against them, that they don't find it legitimate when they are ordered to, when they're ordered by private arbitrators to pay foreign investors large sums of money. That's the understanding. This is then used to tell the story of investment arbitration as a Frankensteinian neo-colonial instrument that turned against its creator, an instrument that was designed by the global North to hold states from the global South accountable, but was then turned against countries of the global North. And this is what then led to the dissatisfaction with it. Don't use our weapons to shoot us, the motto is thought to be. We, countries of the global North, we don't like to be held accountable for what we do. So we change the discourse from what we previously said to now say investment arbitration actually is not legitimate. That story is then sometimes extended to say that countries of the global North simply don't like supranational powers and international courts and tribunals in general. They don't want to be held accountable by others than themselves. This is thought to be part of the general backlash against international courts and tribunals and against anything supranational, really, anything that smacks of world governments. If you look at what states actually do in detail, these stories don't completely pan out, at least as regards investment arbitration. States across the board, global North and global South, react most strongly and by far to claims that they have won. States claims that they have successfully deflected, in which they have not been held accountable. They react significantly less to investment arbitration claims which led them to have to pay large sums of money in compensation to foreign investors. States, if you look at their behavior, not what they say, they don't seem to find investment arbitration that they lose to be illegitimate. Strange. They don't seem to find it illegitimate to be held accountable by investment arbitration as a supranational power of sorts, as an instance of global administrative law. They seem to have no problem with the principle that the weapons they designed are then used to shoot them. It is what they are sued over that is the problem. This is what they react to. In an ongoing study with Leopoldo Biffi, a PhD student of my longtime co-author Cédric Dupont, and a member of my research group, and with Umut Yüksel, a postdoc in Barcelona, in the study we find highly significant statistical evidence that states lower investor protection in the BITs, in the bilateral investment treaties. They do that primarily after having been sued not just in any investment arbitration, but in investment arbitrations with high degrees of sovereign sensitivity. And even more so when the claims have a high degree of what we call axiological sensitivity. And yet these claims, the states usually win. The idea is this: if you look at investment arbitration claims, you see quite different types among them. They range from SOEs, state-owned enterprises, SOEs essentially not paying their dues under a contract, to investors being expropriated without compensation to make room for a construction project, to states deciding they want to protect public health and the environment more, and thereby make the activities of certain foreign investors less profitable. Axiological, the word I used previously, I will use again, axiological refers to value judgments, which can be collective and can relate to what a society wants to prioritize, protecting the environment or protecting economic growth or anything else. Some types of investment arbitrations have very little to do with value judgments, with axiological questions. For instance, an SOE, a state-owned enterprise, not paying a bill is not typically a matter of great social debates about what values to prioritize. Contract lawyers might disagree, but it's a matter of scale. If, for instance, a Spanish investor, that's the current case, if a Spanish investor is suing Morocco because the government messed up a large real estate project, few people can generally say that this interferes with weighty moral ponderings in society. Other types of investment arbitrations, by contrast, are highly axiologically sensitive. For instance, when a government decides to phase out coal energy, do we want cheaper energy and faster economic growth in the short term? Or do we want cleaner air and lower global temperatures and sustainable growth? That is a societal question. It's a matter of social value judgment. What kind of society do we want to have? That is not something for an arbitral tribunal to decide, or so states seem to think if you look at their behavior in renegotiating the treaties. But back to the core point. The higher the axiological and sovereignty sensitivity of an investment arbitration claim, the higher the chance that the states will actually win the case. That finding was not, that has been shown by a political scientist called Christoph Pelch at Oxford. But even though the states tend to win these cases, the point is, these are the cases, that's what we are finding, these are the cases that lead to BIT renegotiating the treaties in order to lower foreign investor protection. You sue me, you win. Sorry, you sue me, I win, and yet I lower your protection in the future because I don't like what you sued me over. Okay. The most critical of these cases, those with high axiological sensitivity, they represent only 2.7% of all cases. 2.7%. These are the most sovereignty sensitive cases of all, and they are the ones which by far are the most likely to trigger BIT renegotiation. Less than 3% of the investment arbitration claims are those which really make states react. States, if you look at their behavior, they seem to find less than 3% of the investment arbitration cases to be truly illegitimate enough to do something about it. Less than 3% of the investment arbitration claims seem to be the real crux of this whole predicament. It's a tiny fraction of the cases, and it's a fraction that investors don't even usually win. Now, you might say, okay, so the system is self-correcting. Investment arbitration goes too far, goes into this axiological terrain. Investment arbitration goes too far, reaches into the domain of high axiological sensitivity, and states retrench investor protection. We have designed the system goes too far, we pull it back. What goes too far is pulled back. Just let the system go, and it will self-stabilize. Arguably, the system is self-correcting. This idea that you bring claims, states don't like it, and they change the treaties on which these claims are brought. Arguably, I repeat, the system is self-correcting, but arguably only. Because as I said at the outset today, referring to Wolfgang Alchner's study, if you change the treaties, if you retrench investor protection in the BATs, the decisions come out the same. The law on the books of the system is self-correcting, if you will, not the law in action, which seems to require another kind of intervention. Which brings me to the second misunderstanding in approaching the investment arbitration system. The misunderstanding is about the difference between complicated systems and complex systems. A complicated system is something like an airplane, even a large Boeing. If you tighten or loosen one of the many screws on the plane, they're actually called fasteners on planes because there aren't only screws, properly speaking. And I'm told there are more than 3 million fasteners on a Boeing 747. Anyway, if you tighten or loosen one of these fasteners, you know what the results of that are going to be. You can accurately predict the effects of an intervention in the system. To change something on the plane, a small thing, you know how the plane is going to behave. A bit of this results predictably in a bit of that. A complicated system has direct and clear cause and effect relationship. Causal links in such a system are typically quite straightforward and linear, of the type A causes B. You change A, you get a predictable difference in B. In the 747 and Boeing 747, there are 3 million A-B causal chains in parallel. You can know them all, actually, a bit better. You can control them all, and you can predict how the plane will fly you home. This is what makes engineering attractive. Direct and predictable action and reaction. You change something, you have immediately the results. Thinking in terms of complicated systems, whether the system really is complicated or not, thinking in terms of complicated system leads us to tend to focus on detail. One of the 3 million details in my 747 example. This some people also call tree-by-tree thinking. A complex system is something like a forest, like a body, like the economy. A forest is not merely a collection of trees, one next to the other. If you cut 3% of the trees, you don't simply have 3% fewer trees, in particular if the 3% all belong to the same species. Or if you add the 3% of a new species, you won't simply have a 3% larger forest. You may instead lose half the forest because the new trees affect animals and insects and fungi and moss and microorganisms, which in turn affect the other trees in unpredicted ways, which in turn affect the new trees in unpredicted ways, upsetting the entire local ecosystem. Same with the body. I have a knee operation and my hand swells. Who would have predicted that? I fall in love and my back pain goes away. Who would have thought? Or the economy. The UK has repeatedly tried to intervene over the last months and years to intervene in the British economy in order to try to fix it, mostly with unexpected results. Things have gotten worse. In such systems, individual components, in complex systems, individual components come together to form a larger, more complex structure that has properties which are not simply the sum of the individual components. The interactions between the components of the system are essential. And they are difficult, if not impossible, to predict accurately. The chains of causal links are entangled. They're not linear. A doesn't simply cause B, and that's it. A causes B, but also D, E, and P, and F reinforces A, but decreases P while causing M, D triggers R, Q, and X feeds back into A, and so on and so forth. You change A, you're not sure what is going to come out of the system in the end. Complex systems are systems in which interventions can produce no results at all. In such systems, they are resilient, as we sometimes say. If you've ever taken medication which has had no effect, even though it did intervene in your body and increased or decreased some substance in your body, then you know what I'm talking about. Complex systems are also systems in which interventions can produce unexpected results, different in magnitude than expected, or different in nature than expected. You take a placebo or a homeopathic treatment, which has no direct cause and effect relationship with your body, and yet your body gets better. My new girlfriend takes my hand and it fixes my back. A silly little bee stings me and I die. Changing BITs is an intervention, changing BITs is an intervention in the system of investment arbitration. As I have repeatedly said, Wolfgang Altscher showed that this intervention changed nothing. The system of investment arbitration so far has been resilient, has absorbed that attempt to change it. Arguably, the introduction of amicus curiae briefs in investment arbitration and other procedural interventions in the system have likewise changed nothing to the effects of the system, to what comes out of it. That was the Federico Ortino study I mentioned earlier. We lawyers are badly positioned to make sense of that. We are badly positioned to make sense of that because we are trained to focus on detail. And because we tend to think that what we see is what is. I'm an arbitrator. The slightest change of the slightest comma in the institutional arbitration rules changes what I have to do and likely what I indeed do. But that doesn't mean it's a difference that makes a difference. We are also badly positioned, we lawyers, to make sense of legal regimes as complex systems because of the legal ideology that has been dominating us. I mean legal positivism in the sense of the credo that the judge and the arbitrator apply law to facts in order to come to a result following logical, syllogistical reasoning. In this ideology, words can have objective meanings. In this ideology, the law has a direct cause and effect relationship with the decision. And an exclusive relationship at that, in the sense that external factors, not readily identifiable, they play no role. If we believe that changing a treaty applied by an arbitrator will logically entail a change in the decision she makes, we are caught by that ideology. And we read the system as a complicated one. If you told a psychologist or a sociologist or an anthropologist that rules have changed, yet people still behave the same way, they would barely be surprised because they are trained to think in terms of complex systems. Let us assume you reduce the overall level of foreign investor protection in the treaties. In this ongoing study with Leopoldo Biffi and Umut Yüksel, I've mentioned, we have found a reduction of foreign investor protection in treaties by about 30 to 40% over the last 30 years. Foreign investors today in the treaties, not in the way the decisions come out in the treaties, they are protected to 30 to 40% less than they were 30 years ago. So again, let us assume that you reduce the level of foreign investor protection in the treaties by 30%, which means you increase the level of regulatory space for states by an equivalent 30%. And you do that to avoid the 3% of axiologically sensitive cases I have mentioned. In complicated thinking, in traditional legal thinking, you would expect, what you would expect is reduction by 30% of investor protection in the decisions. It directs cause and effect relationship. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen because something else happened, which complex thinking might allow us to see. So what happened in the situation described by Alchner? Clearly something else than the treaties influenced the decision-making. Now, if you ask what really is likely to influence decision-making, we enter the terrain of complexity. Because an array of different factors come into the mix in influencing decision-making of people, including of judges and arbitrators. That's when we start to look at the entire system of investment arbitration as a complex system. So, for instance, in this case, in this situation described by Alchner, lower investor protection in the treaties, the decisions come out the same. In this situation, something other than the treaties influenced interpretation. Among these other things are probably the individual mindsets of arbitrators and their collective mindset. Now, where do they in turn come from? Let me touch on just one of the many factors that likely influences this mindset of arbitrators, of the decision makers. If the revenues, the money they make, of arbitrators increased over the same time as the treaties changed, it may have increased an overall focus on the money in the field. It may have exacerbated the sense of greed that permeates the field. That may have attracted the greedier among us to the field. We do what we do because of the intrinsic motivation of doing what is right and interesting, and because of the extrinsic motivation of the money. If you change that balance between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, you change the overall mindset, and therefore you change the decisions. Now, what in turn influenced this? What influenced this change in the mindset? Well, among others, arbitration institutions have increased the rates they pay to arbitrators, and procedures have become longer, for instance, which means that arbitrators are paid more than they used to be. Long-term arbitrator bashing that has been a sport for a long time. People call it arbitrator bashing, complaining it's all the fault of arbitrators. Long-term arbitrator bashing may have changed that balance too by moving out of the fields people who are sensitive to bashing, who care about doing the right thing. If arbitrator bashing was an intervention in the system meant to increase regulatory space of states, it may have achieved the opposite results. Again, a complex system kind of reaction. Now, where did the bashing come from? From more information about the cases, among others. Where did more information about the cases come from? Well, from rules on transparency, among other things. Where did the rules on transparency come from? And so on it goes, regression of causality after regression of causality in a big entangled web. That is complex thinking. Now, you might think, okay, fine. It's complex, so which means we cannot know. No, complexity does not entail agnosticism or skepticism. It's not that we can't know and that we can't do anything. We do go to doctors for our complex bodies and minds, and we do try to manage our complex economy. We do something to help various complex ecosystems, but we do it cautiously. And as much as possible, we try to think of all the different entangled causal links between the system's various elements. These elements can be charted, not with perfect precision, but they can give some indication. It's a matter of precision. Complicated thinking is about precision. Complex thinking is about broad pictures with many elements. We are working on a book with Cédric Dupont, whom I mentioned earlier on, in which we are precisely trying to do this. exploring what complex systems thinking can help us see in investment arbitration, mapping as many of the interactions in the system as possible. I wanted to show the charts, but it's already quite, it's all quite a bit much. I'm soon done. At this stage, some people might think, oh, investment arbitration is a resilient system. Political discontent and the related interventions in the system, it's just huffing and puffing. And the house is solid enough to not be blown away, or rather it is adaptable and resilient enough to continue without worries. We who do investment arbitration, why care about the discontent? They have tried to change the system, nothing happened, so we can gladly continue. No. Interventions in complex systems can produce unexpected results, possibly very upsetting results. My example earlier of planting new trees in a forest leading to the destruction of half the forest is a case in point. An intervention in a system can be like a little bee stinging and triggering an anaphylactic shock. It's not clear just yet what intervention in the system could trigger such vast reactions, but regimes have been found to crumble after a relatively small initial intervention. Think of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, think of the quite sudden fall of the Soviet Union. A small thing made it all crumble. The second reason to not think the system is endlessly resilient is the conceptual between stocks and flows. That takes me to the third misunderstanding in how we approach investment arbitration. I'll be quite brief about it, because I'm nearing the end of my time too. So over the previous few minutes, I've spoken of causal links in a way that assumes that changes are immediate. Change one element of the system translates without wait to changes elsewhere in the system. This may make us assume that if we change the treaties and nothing has happened so far, nothing will happen. That if there is discontent with investment arbitration and the decisions haven't changed so far, and ISDS practice has remained fundamentally the same, nothing will happen. We could not have predicted that these interventions would yield no change because it's a complex system. But once we have seen they have caused little effect, if any, we may start to think that if we do it again, nothing much will happen. That would be a confusion between flow-type causal links and stock-type causal links. Flow-type causal links in complex systems thinking, so it's a bit, well, complicated. These are things like going to the gym. You go more often, you feel mentally better, more or less immediately. It's a complex reaction, but it's immediate. Stock-type causal links are situations in which a stock of something needs to reach a certain level to have an effect. A common example is friendship. A friend pulls one over you, does something nasty to you. Nothing changes. You forgive. No one is perfect. A friendship is not a tit-for-tat relationship. The friend pulls another one over you, still no change. No effect on the friendship. And then the 10th time, it's over. The friendship is, all of a sudden, it seems, dead. The stock reached a certain level, and then the effects took place. In investment arbitration, if we keep changing the treaties, perhaps at some stage, the stock of general understanding of how these treaties are to be read will change, will flip. If it flips, it may happen like the flip of a switch very suddenly. Perhaps once the stock of discontent is full enough, the trend of including ISDS clauses in BATs will suddenly reverse. Perhaps the collective mindset of arbitrators will all of a sudden flip. Sudden changes in group opinion have been studied since the 1920s, at least. That's what happens in fashion as well. So when we try to change something in the system, it matters to distinguish between what is a flow leading quickly to reactions and what is a stock leading to reactions only once a certain level of something has been reached, a level which may not be obvious, which may not be conspicuous. It's obvious once you think it. But thinking of it in the first place does not seem obvious. In the huge debate on ISDS reform, thinking of it has only been mentioned in passing and with a quite different spin in a paper by Anthea Roberts and Taylor St. John in the American Journal of International. Speaking of mindsets, brings me to my last points. I promise I'm really soon done. The fourth and last misunderstanding in how we think about investment arbitration, the question of what kind of justice arbitration and investment arbitration is meant to deliver. I'll be very brief about it. For 2,500 years, arbitration was a different thing than it is today, than it has been for the last 80 years. For 2,500 years, arbitration was aiming at and trying to deliver an alternative to courts, which was not only alternative in the degree of neutrality and the choice of decision makers, but it was also an alternative kinds of justice. Arbitration, throughout more than 95% of its history, was not simply privatized formal justice, the equivalent of a court, but privatized with procedural adjustments to make it more neutral and ideally more efficient. Arbitrators used to deal in what the ancient Romans called auctoritas, literally authority, but here in the specific sense of doing what is good for society, not what is good for the parties before them, but good for wider society. Arbitrators used to be expected to deliver distributive justice, to give each their due, including persons beyond the parties. And this would be based on wide considerations, on fundamental principles, on some understanding of equity. About 80 years ago, arbitration became less supple, more formalistic, more mechanical, more syllogistical, more rigid, dealing in greater normative density, more self-constrained, increasingly obsessed with the parties before it and the fact that they pay the arbitral tribunal. It started dealing no longer in distributive justice, but in commutative justice, which concerns itself with the fulfillment of contractual or contractual-like obligations of the two parties before the arbitral tribunal. It became obsessed with what Simon Bezat, a recent PhD graduate, and now a co-author with me on these questions. Arbitration became obsessed with what Simon Bezat calls contractual positivism. It is an outgrow of sorts of legal positivism in the way I described it. Only contractual positivism sanctifies not black letter law rules in general, but the contract. Specifically, arbitration sanctifies the contract, which again precisely excludes interests from the rest of society. Arbitration arguably has lost its soul. It has lost the specific characteristic which made it a key legal institution in every society I read about for over 2,500 years. That mindset in arbitration, that kind of justice we approach it with, it has turned us arbitrators into what in German is so aptly yet so provocatively called Fachidioten. We have become people with great legal, technical expertise, but with a very narrow field of attention, not seeing and thus not understanding the wider effects of society and thus the wider discontent it creates. A complete tree-by-tree approach. I have done nothing wrong, we arbitrators tend to say. I have just rigorously applied the rules and in particular the contracts. But that's precisely the problem. Hiding behind the rules and the contract, dura lex sed lex, sorry, the law is tough, but it's the law, I just apply it, or the contract, that precisely would have been considered doing a poor job at being an arbitrator throughout its 2,500-year history and until less than a century ago. Courts could do that. Arbitrators were meant to precisely not do that. They were meant to particularly care about the general interests of society, to smoothen the law when it is unfair. Of course, if the mindset of arbitrators is to focus only on the parties and to treat amicus curiae briefs as footnotes, no wonder social discontent keeps rising. I don't have a silver bullet. I don't have a simple solution to offer. I don't have an operational plan to suggest. The ideas I discuss cannot be immediately implemented. I speak to you as an academic. In that capacity, I don't do law. I try to think about law. I try to make people think, that's all. If you're now more puzzled than when I began, that's good. It is in uncertainty that we can find a place to think together about this beautiful and eternal thing that arbitration is. Thank you very much.